Let's talk about culture shock. When you go into a new culture, it's easy to observe things that are strange and different, strange practices, different concepts of beauty and adornment. That might be the initial culture shock. Different ways of doing things. So there's an initial culture shock when you first get there. And this culture shock may last a few days. But then you begin to feel like you kind of have a handle on it, right? You begin to realize, okay, here's the way they do it. And you begin to think that you've got a handle on it. But there's another culture shock that is kind of a delayed shock, kind of an aftershock, if you go to live in a country, all right? So a short mission trip, a week or two somewhere, you may have that first culture shock and be over it by the time the week is done. And you'll come back and talk about all the strange things that you saw. And you'll think that, okay, if I were to go back there and live, I pretty well understand now how they are. Okay, I know what they eat, I know what to avoid, I know what to not do to avoid giving offense. You think you're pretty well over it, and you know what the hard things would be about living there. You know, maybe there's one kind of food you just really want to avoid. Make sure nobody puts that on your plate. You know, things like that. But you can handle that. But if you were to go there and live, over the course of a few months, you would find yourself experiencing another kind of tension that is a delayed culture shock. And on the page that you have there is some description of what that culture shock is like. And I remember when I went to Ukraine, the first time I went was for a 2-week trip to teach. And I didn't really experience much culture shock on that short visit. Before I got on the plane, my wife said to me, you know, you'll probably come back changed by this experience, right? And I said, well, maybe some, but probably not a lot. I said, because I'm already interested in missions. You know, some people, they go to a mission field and come back all fired up about missions, but I was already fired up about missions. So, and I said, if I ever wanted to become a full-time missionary, it would be Ukraine. I'd rather go, you know, to me, a mission field was a place that was hot and had jungles and that kind of thing. To me, that was mission field, not a place with broken up blacktop and old concrete apartment buildings, which is what Kyiv was. And I didn't think I'd be interested. I just was interested in going and teaching on different fields and helping out the way best I could. Well, I got there, and by the way, Dr. Bird was with me on that trip. And my first invitation to even go was indirectly. Melvin Adams sent Mark a note saying, why don't you come over and teach a class? And then later he wrote to him again and said, why don't you and Steve come over and teach a class? And that's the most of an invitation I even got. But we decided to go together, and we enjoyed doing that. And at first I thought I would turn it down. I was teaching at UBC at the time. I was teaching about 7 classes. Some of them were new to me. And so I was just working really hard. And you may think you know what it's like to sit up late trying to finish assignments. But look at it from the perspective of a teacher who was teaching classes he's never taught before, and he's sitting there at his computer at 11 o'clock at night, and he's so tired, but he doesn't have everything ready for tomorrow, you know. And I've been in that situation many times in classes that I had not taught before. And so I thought, I shouldn't even take this. I should just turn it down. Well, I told my wife, I said, I shouldn't even consider this, right? It would cost about $1,000 to go. And I was so busy, and we were struggling to make it. I was working at a fast food place part-time to make a go of it. And she said, well, you better pray about it. And I was kind of surprised, because I thought when I said I shouldn't even think about it, shouldn't even consider this, right? I figured she'd say, yeah, there's no way you can go. But she said, you need to pray about it. So I said, okay, well, I'll pray about it. So the next day, during my devotion, I said something like, okay, Lord, this invitation to Ukraine, I probably shouldn't even go, right? And I was just expecting to hear this, just that closed off and then go on. But I didn't get that. It was like it was just still kind of open. And I said, Lord, I shouldn't go, right? And it still just kind of stayed open. And so over the next day or two, I continued to pray about it, and I began to feel like I should go. And so I went $1,000 deeper in debt and bought a ticket, and we went. And from the time that I landed there, something began to happen to me. And there wasn't much attractive. It was November, it was rainy, it was cold, and the streets, everything was drab, and these old run-down apartment buildings that under communism they couldn't keep up, and everything was in bad shape. But I had my first classes at the college, and then on Saturday we went out and worked on the campus where they were going to try to build the college, and then on Sunday I was in church. And by Sunday night, I was convinced that I wanted to be in Ukraine more than anything else in the world. And I was not one of these people that gets dragged kicking and screaming to be a missionary somewhere. I didn't know if I had a call or not, but I was begging God to give me one. Okay? And that's the best way, I guess, for it to happen. I was saying, Lord, I really want to come to Ukraine. Would you please let me know for sure that I am called to Ukraine? And Mark wasn't affected at all the same way. He continued to go back and teach classes over the next several years. But he was not called the same way I was. And so I ended up, it was a year and a half before we actually went, but we went and lived there for 5 years and taught in the Bible college. And I thought before I went, I can handle this culture. I can see there's a lot of waiting in line, especially at government offices and things like that. But for me, everything was an adventure. I just enjoyed walking down to the bazaars and buying stuff and riding on the public transportation, the trams and the metros and stuff. But after I had been there for a few months, I realized something was happening to me. And I began to realize that I was feeling irritable a lot of the time. And the things that people were doing would irritate me. Their manners were quite different from what I was used to. Okay? I learned the word for excuse me, and I would say that when I would bump into somebody but I never heard anybody say it to me. They weren't people that say excuse me. They were people that shove in. Okay? And you go to stand in line somewhere and people are just crowding in, and you've got to crowd up if you're going to get served. And I just began to, and they're just things that we would call rude, would be considered rudeness to us. It's common for men when they're discussing what needs to be done on a car, whether it's the carburetor or whatever it is, to stand there and holler at each other over what needs to be done on the car, and to demean the knowledge of the other person, how dumb you are to think that that's what it needs. That's common. And that kind of stuff just began to irritate me, to where I began to realize every time I was going out, I just expected to be, and I was even on guard to keep people from shoving in line and get in front of me and things like that. And I began to realize I was experiencing this delayed culture shock. And I remember talking to some of my students there about it, and they understood to some extent. They saw those things as flaws in their own culture, and yet, of course, they came from it. He lists here some symptoms, and I didn't experience all of these. And I think part of it is the quicker you realize what you're in, the quicker you can come out of it. The more quickly you can come out of it. So overall symptoms: anxiety, homesickness, helplessness. That's where you have all these situations and you just don't know what to do about because they're so unfamiliar. And the people that you would normally turn to for help with that are not there. And the people that are there, their way of solving the problem is so different from what you would expect that it doesn't seem like a solution at all. So you just seem helpless. Boredom. This can happen especially if you do not have a clear role there. And so you get there and there are these periods of time when you don't really know what you're supposed to be doing. You don't have anything to do. That didn't happen to me that much. But it does sometimes, especially if you're part of an organization that is not real organized. Depression, fatigue, confusion, self-doubt, where you begin to wonder, is what I am doing really worthwhile? Do I really have the abilities to accomplish anything here? Feelings of inadequacy, unexplained fits of weeping, paranoia, that's where you become afraid of everything. And on a mission field, there's a balance with this because there are real dangers. That varies, of course, from place to place. But I remember my wife for a little while, which partly this came because we had an attempted break-in while we were there one night. Some people were trying to break in our door, and that kind of makes you nervous then in the future. And she actually stood there and held the door locks to keep them from being able to turn them because they were trying to stick something into the thing and turn it. So she stood there and held the door lock so they couldn't get in. And I was there ready to back her up with a hammer. And but that was a stressful situation. Well, from then on, we lived on the ground floor of this big apartment building. from then on, anytime we would walk into the building, if there were people there, she would be nervous. It might be an old lady getting her mail out of the mailbox, but it's like, oh man, there's people in here. Well, of course, 1,000 people live in that building. You're going to be in contact with people. But you get this sense of fear all the time. And the same apartment we lived in was actually the same one that Melvin had been attacked and beaten nearly to death. So there was a history there. They knew that rich Americans, in their concept, rich Americans lived there. So, but it can get to where you have this sense of paranoia, and to where you're not able to distinguish between real dangers and imaginary ones. There's physical ailments and psychosomatic illnesses. And so then withdrawal or aggressive symptoms. See, this can swing either way, or possibly could be mixed in some people. But there's the withdrawal, spending excessive amounts of time reading. That's basically, reading is a great thing. Not very many people do it anymore. But they're talking about this as a withdrawal away from contact with people. Too much sleep, only wanting to hang out with other Americans or people that are from your culture, avoiding contact with the host nationals, and so on. So you don't need me to read over all of this, but it also, obviously, in the aggressive symptoms in the middle there are family tensions, marital stress, excessive chauvinism, and that's talking about feeling the need to defend your own culture, because you're in a place where the things that you valued may not be valued by them, and there may be things that you were good at that don't matter over there at all, and so you tend to feel like you need to be telling people how great American culture is, or whatever culture you're from, because you feel like they're not respecting it enough. But a missionary, if you fall into that trap, if you fall into doing that, trying to tell people how great America is and why don't they realize it, that's not what you're there for. You're not there to be a missionary for America. Okay? And that leads to a lot of problems. So anyway, you see the list there. So again, one of the key things on culture shock is to remember, and I did not realize for a while that that's what I was in, because I'd been there for a while. I'd been there, I don't know how long, 5 months maybe. And I thought, how could I be having culture shock? In fact, I told people before that, I didn't have any culture shock. I told them I didn't have any culture. I enjoyed being there, loved it, and I didn't have any culture shock. And I didn't realize that I was having this delayed culture shock after I'd been there for a while.